Oh boy. Last year I was like kind of nervous to make this video. I think because at the time I just kind of felt like it was a very self-indulgent thing. I think last year people did enjoy it. I definitely had fun making it. Just to kind of have like a rundown of everything I worked on, everything I feel like these projects taught me. I think it's a good space to just kind of like document how I feel sort of in the moment. I thought originally that I had written less this year in terms of like the amount of different projects that I worked on, but I kind of worked on about the same amount of new stuff. However, I do feel like I accomplished more than I did, like more this year than I did last year, in the sense that I've hit some kind of personal writing milestones, I guess. Settling into my writing style this year, really happy about that. Like that's a tangible improvement that I can feel from my writing. I was able to sell my first short story this year, which is really exciting, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. For these projects, for most of them, I've written at least like one completed draft. Not all of them are finished, or some of them are currently in an unfinished revision state. So yeah, let's get into it. All right, let's just start with this one. Let's like rip it like a band-aid. Project Moon. This is an untitled project. It is a young adult fantasy. If you've been following some of my videos this year, you might know this already, but this year I made the very difficult decision to shelve this book. So Project Moon, if you're unfamiliar, it was a young adult fantasy. It was sort of this like adventure story. It was this political intrigue, court intrigue kind of drama. It had an ensemble cast. It was inspired by Philippine mythology. Story that I originally brainstormed about 4 years ago. So it's old, and I finished writing it in 2021, and at the start of this year I was kind of working on, I shouldn't say working on revisions, but I was like brainstorming and contemplating revisions, and I out with a beta reader, and I won't go into all of my thought process in terms of why I eventually shelved that project, because it was a whole thing. I literally have a whole video on why I quit this book why I decided to shelve it, and what it means to quit a project, and how do you know when it's the right time to let a project go. So you can watch that video if you're interested. But, long story short, it was definitely a project that taught me a lot. I needed to write it at the time because it was the kind of story that I wanted to read, and it was important to me at the time, but I just kind of outgrew it. It's always a tough thing to quit a project that you're really passionate about. And so I think one main thing that this book really taught me, that it's okay to quit a project, and that the time that you spent writing it is not wasted. And it's sad, but you'll recover from it. The other things that this project taught me was honestly just like writing fundamentals. Like pacing was a huge one. This was a huge issue in draft one. This book taught me a lot about what it means to really pace the action of your story, kind of trying to hone that gut feeling as a writer in terms of when is the story going too quickly? When is it going too slowly? When do you need to linger with your characters a little bit longer? The other thing that this book really taught me was the importance of, I guess, the relationship between internal and external conflict in a story. For me, as like a character-driven writer, it's important for me to understand how the external plot and events of the story are going to affect every single character, and how it's going to shape the arc of that character and how they're going to grow. I think when I started writing this book, I didn't have it figured out as robustly. Basically, this book had 4 main characters, and 2 of the main characters were definitely a lot more fleshed out internally in terms of their arcs, and the other 2, I was just kind of winging it. And so when everything started to fall apart in the last act of the book, I realized that a lot of it came from the fact that I didn't know my main characters as deeply as I thought I did. And then the last really important lesson that I learned from this book was character dynamics and honing writing dialogue. I think dialogue is like one of my favorite things to write because there are 4 main characters in this book. I really had to figure out the different ways that they spoke and really differentiating their voices. Obviously, because you have this ensemble cast, you want the characters to be able to bounce off of each other. It is shelved indefinitely, but you know, we still love her. All right, next, let's talk about Nightward. This book, I finished writing draft 1 of it in March or April. Now it is in its 2nd draft. I'm about 30-ish% of the way through revising my 2nd draft. So finishing draft 1 of this book was probably one of the biggest accomplishments of the year for me. It's basically like a colonial Philippine inspired jazz age setting, also pulls from Philippine folklore. I documented my entire process of writing this book on this channel. Like almost every vlog I think from the past year was me writing this damn book. So I feel like, you know, if you watch my vlogs, like, you know, it was a whole up and down situation. So this book follows 2 protagonists named Annalyn and Felix. The 2 of them sort of cross paths for some reason, and they reluctantly team up in order to investigate a series of strange incidents that's occurring in their city. And their investigation ends up leading them to all sorts of weird and dangerous places, and there's monsters and magic. It's one of the most, like, I guess, own voices projects that I've ever written, and it was a really rewarding experience to write this book because I had a lot of doubts along the way. For like half of the first draft, I felt like I didn't fully know what I was doing, and I was like, I felt like it took me a while to connect with the characters. It felt like it took me a while to feel settled into this secondary world that I was writing. But I think by the end of it, like even when I was feeling really unmotivated to finish it, by the end of it, I remember, and I think I like vlogged about this at the time, but I was writing one of the last chapters in this book, and writing it made me cry. It was the first time that had ever happened to me. Like I'd never cried from my own writing before until I was like writing this like one chapter. I think that was the sort of the main moment, I guess, and I realized that I had connected a lot more deeply to this story than I thought I did. I don't know if I've ever said this like on my channel. Nightward, this is the first book that I think I wrote explicitly like for the market. And none of the other projects that I've written, I've thought too deeply about like publishing and querying and stuff. This was a book that like in its inception, I was like trying to think about pitchability and stuff like that. I think some writers like they tend to like call these kinds of books like sellout books. You know, I know some writers say that lovingly. For me, I don't like to call it a sellout book because it does mean a lot to me. But I did write this book with a lot of like tropes and marketing in mind, which is why it's like a little bit more tropey than my usual stuff, but in a good way. But yeah, because I wrote it thinking about publishing explicitly, I think it surprised me when I realized how much I was actually really enjoying this book, really enjoying the characters, coming out of this book, learning a lot more than I thought I was going to, and feeling like a much stronger writer. Like, I don't think I would have gotten to where I am right now if it wasn't for really pushing myself to finish this book. Things that I learned from writing Nightward, firstly is atmosphere and description. This secondary world that I was writing is very like jazz age inspired. It takes place in like early 20th century, you know, colonial inspired Philippines. I don't know, I think when you think jazz age, you think, or at least I think, a very romantic kind of atmosphere, you know, almost flowery in a way. Prior to writing Nightward, I was kind of in this mood of writing in a more like, you know, minimalist, more typical genre fiction way. And so with Nightward, I kind of was trying to push myself to be a little bit more flowery with my language. The other thing that this book really forced me to learn was how to write a balanced, slow burn romance. I really struggle with romance, I think because I have such a particular way that I like to write it. And when I say particular, I mean slow burn. I just don't tend to write romances that are very close to the surface, like where characters are very forthcoming about their feelings. I think part of that is like my own personality, but I think I just find a lot of joy in the challenge of writing characters that are scared of their own feelings and slowly having to learn how to not be scared of that vulnerability. But it is quite difficult, and I think with Annalyn and Felix, they're definitely like textbook definition of those characters. Both of them are so singularly focused on the individual things that they want to accomplish. I wanted to, write a slow burn romance that feels earned but also realistic in the context of a single book. I ended up having a lot more fun writing Anna and Felix's dynamic than I thought I would. I thought that writing the romance would be like one of the last things that I enjoyed, but there are certain chapters and scenes and moments that were really, really fun. Both of them are just like so emotionally constipated. Okay, next, another thing that this book really taught me was about just writing magic systems, and more important for my writing style at least, that my magic system is comprehensible more than complex. It's important that the reader understands the magic system, because some of the drama, or a lot of the drama in the story, comes from understanding the rules of the magic system and then how certain players in the story are like operating outside those rules, or like bending what these characters think they know about the magic in this world. The other thing this book taught me was scene efficiency and expediting exposition. What I learned from Project Moon is that not everything needs to be a scene. Some things can be a paragraph, some things can be taken out entirely. With Nightward, I really tried to hone the sense of like efficiency and making sure that the pacing of each act was equal. Okay, let's talk about Blanco. This is what I've been dedicating most of my time to. So Project Blanco is my adult sci-fi cyberpunk. It's definitely been a roller coaster and a half writing this damn thing. Okay, let's talk about it. So currently I'm not in a place where I can comfortably share details about the premise or the plot of the story yet. What I will say about it is that it is a frame story. It takes place in like the 2070s. Follows a man in his late 20s who moves to a new city for a certain job opportunity. While he's there, some crazy stuff happens, and the book is basically the main character recounting the events of the crazy stuff that had happened. The story cuts back and forth between the events of this crazy time and present day. And so in the present day, there's like a hint at an overarching mystery. That's the frame story element of it. Almost a dual timeline story, but it's more of like an 80-20 split instead of a 50-50 split. So I don't really consider it a dual timeline story, because most of the book does not focus on the present day outer mystery. It's just something that happens and is resolved like towards the end of the book. But to give context on this project, I originally brainstormed it back in 2020. Back then, the story was completely different. The premise of this book is one that at the time, like 2 years ago when I first came up with the idea, my skill as a writer was not on par yet with how ambitious this idea is. Like, it was one of those story ideas where I was like, I literally am not good enough to execute it at the right level. I did attempt to write it at the time. I wrote about 45,000 words of it before realizing that the plot was just I was literally like losing the plot. It was falling apart. I shelved it indefinitely at the time. And the reason I came back to it this year is because I've always been enamored by cyberpunk as a genre. I've talked about it many times on this channel, but I think cyberpunk is so rich in ideas. There's so much interesting and horrific commentary that you can make about our current capitalist structures in the context of, a tech-driven, corporate-driven dystopian. That those are the qualities that really, define a cyberpunk world. I spent the next 2 years thinking a lot about late-stage capitalism. Anyways, eventually, after all the time I spent mulling these cyberpunk ideas in my head, ended up brainstorming an idea for a short story called Sway With Me Until We Bleed, which I'll talk about in a sec. That's the next thing I'm going to talk about on this list. So that short story is this, deep internal exploration of type of person who would exist in a supposed cyberpunk world. And after I wrote that story, I felt very empowered to return to Project Blanco. The cyberpunk ideas that I had rolling around in my head suddenly felt so much more enriched and fleshed out. Back in September of this year, I completely re-outlined Blanco and I brainstormed new ideas for the plot. Now writing this book is genuinely like, it's been some of the most fun that I've ever had writing a book ever. Yeah, was I put on this earth in order to just like write cyberpunk stories about capitalist nightmares? Maybe I was. I feel like if I ever finish writing Project Blanco, my soul will be at peace. I could honestly retire from writing entirely, as long as I know that I've written this book. You know, Blanco isn't just a book that I'm writing because I hope others will enjoy it. I mean, I do hope that I could one day have the chance to get it out there and that other people will enjoy it and that it's not too like weird of a concept to reach people. But it's, I think more than that, for me, it's a project that feels like earned after so much time spent, you know, honing my craft. And it is kind of a weird and ambitious idea, but I've spent many years trying to get better as a writer, and I feel like I am ready to tackle this book, and I am tackling this book and thoroughly enjoying the writing experience.
So far from the ground. Can you see me now?
Let's talk about Sway With Me. So as I just mentioned, this is a cyberpunk short story that I wrote back in June. So this is probably the biggest accomplishment of the year for me. This story is going to be published. It's forthcoming Augur magazine in 2023. So if you're interested in reading it, keep an eye out for more information. I won't share any excerpt for this project because you'll be able to read it in the not so distant future. I have documented quite a bit of the process of writing some of the story. I will link the appropriate vlogs and videos in the description box, but I wrote this story back in June of this year. In the videos where I talk about this project, I've said in those vlogs that this story is one of the most important things I've ever written in the context of my writing journey. Like, if I hadn't written this story, I don't know if I would have returned to writing Project Blanco. This story was like the confidence boost that I needed in order for me to realize that, you know, my writing, and not just in the context of like cyberpunk genre, but my writing in general, I realized that it had improved so much. I got such positive feedback on it, that other people were connecting with it, where the message that I wanted to get across in the story was getting across in the ways that I wanted it to. It was one of those stories that I feel like as a younger writer, I could have never tackled. If I were to show this story to my younger self, she would be surprised. The way that I was able to kind of polish the ideas that I wanted to explore, you know? The other reason that the story was such a turning point for me was because I felt like I really found my writing style with this one in particular. You know, just to speak like broadly, it is my goal as a writer to write speculative stories that toe the line between genre fiction and literary fiction. I guess in simpler terms, there's always this like preconceived notion that genre fiction prose tends to be drier and more matter of fact. While that is true for some stories, because that's the writing style that works for those stories, my main goal is to write character-driven speculative work. Stories that sort of take place in these strange and fantastical worlds, but the narration is very, very introspective and very human-centered and very intimate. And that was what Sway With Me helped me achieve. And I'm so proud of it. Like, I'm really, really proud of this one. Augur was the first place I submitted to, just because around the time that I was writing Sway With Me, it was very close to the Augur deadline. And so I just decided to like throw it in there. It was the first time that I'd ever like submitted a story to a magazine. I wasn't expecting an acceptance. So thrilled that it fit with Augur. I think they're an amazing publication. Because I was like feeling so good about this story and I was really proud of it, I don't think, like, if I had gotten that first rejection, I don't think I would have been too hard on myself, because that's how much I believed in this story. So I'm really, really grateful that, you know, Sway With Me gets to be sort of my first officially published piece of writing, because I think it's a good representation of how I hope to shape my writing career.
See me now.
All right, next we have Merienda. This is a literary short story about cultural roots and ancestry and food. I started writing this last year, actually. I also ended up submitting this story to a magazine, and I haven't heard anything back from that magazine. I actually forgot that I submitted. This is actually the only literary piece that I worked on for the entire year. I don't know, I feel weird about this story. It's just that I don't feel as intensely about my literary work. I used to write exclusively literary fiction a few years ago, and then now I write pretty much exclusively speculative stuff now. So I feel like all my stories that aren't speculative are weaker. I've kind of fallen out of the rhythm of writing literary works, and so anytime there's not a speculative element to explore in the story, I don't get as fired up and excited about it anymore. I don't know if I'm gonna keep revising it and keep submitting this anymore, just because it's not where I want to spend my energy these days. But even if it ends up being a story that just sits on my metaphorical shelf of unpublished works, that's okay too. I'm fine with that. I think there's a lot of pressure to publish. There's a lot of pressure to make every story count towards something, but I think the stories that we write just for ourselves are just as valuable. Writing across different genres and writing different kinds of stories is a great practice to have as a writer, because it does make you think about storytelling in very different ways, and it kind of forces you to think outside of the confines of whatever your preferred genres are.
When I fall back down, will you be around?
Lastly, we have Sketch. This piece is actually untitled. It's nicknamed Sketch right now because the original title of this short story was Sketch of Two Workers on Break circa 1910. I ended up deciding that was not going to be the title, and it's untitled now. So this is a contemporary-ish short story. It's fantastical in nature. It's currently in limbo right now, so I don't really know what to say about it. I'm still working on it because it's a weird dual timeline concept. I can't get the timelines to play off of each other in the way that I want them to, which is why it's kind of in limbo right now. But yeah, so this is a short story that takes place in the world of a larger project. That project I brainstormed a few months ago. It's called Project Wicked. I've talked about it a little bit in my vlog. If I had to comp Project Wicked, I would say it's Atlas 6-ish with some historical fiction / alt history elements thrown in there. This short story, it follows two side characters from Project Wicked. The side characters are investigating some historical incident in this small town. The narration is cutting back and forth between their investigation and this historical incident as it happened at the time. And I think whenever you're writing this non-linear stuff, narratives always get messy really fast. So I think that's what I'm trying to work through at the moment. But yeah, the challenge with this is that it's tough nailing down a tone for this story, because not only does it cut back to stuff that's happening in the early 1900s, even the modern day stuff itself, I haven't written anything remotely contemporary in so long. I haven't had time to hone what I want the atmosphere to really feel like. But I do think that if I can get the right pieces to fall for this story, I think the idea could land really strongly, and I don't want to give up on it yet. I do feel like it's going to take some heavy lifting to marinate the ideas and the themes of this world a little bit longer. And I'm okay with that. I'm trying to, give myself the space and the time to let the marination happen. I think time is one of the best things that you can give to your writing, in my opinion. That is all I have for today. I hope that was interesting to anyone but me. That is pretty much everything that I mainly worked on in the past year. I think all of my other writing time has been spent starting and abandoning short stories, and I brainstormed 2 or 3 new books this year too, but I haven't started writing them, so I just didn't include them in this video. It was funny because I was watching the last year's video, and I literally have this thing that I say in the beginning about how I'm always so hard on myself, and I was just so sad back then. I think I was genuinely coming out of a writing slump, and I wasn't feeling very good about my writing back then, and you could tell. It doesn't matter if you wrote one thing this year or if you wrote 20 things or 200 things. The point is that you wrote something. Let me know how your writing year has been, if you worked on anything that you're super proud of. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope all your writing projects are going well, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
You said always if I stay in your head every